And to repeat three things. So I'm adding on. So now we're up to 3. So this is number 3. And this is 2. So on Wednesday, you have a quiz. I already told you that, right? And the quiz is 3 questions from this test and 3 questions since this test. And the 3 questions from this test are going to be graded 0 or 10. So you either get it right or you get it wrong. But you'll just memorize things and it'll be fun. And I think I already told you next Friday I'm in New York City, so you don't have a class. What else? So I didn't actually give you, the last thing, the minimum wage, we'll keep coming back to that. But I'll tell you, probably by email, we're doing a television thing and radio thing for KUSW and KCTS 9. And they're on the minimum wage piece. It's different from what we did. I'll tell you what we're going to do. Sort of a different view of those things. Let's see. So, I think I told you the range was from about 30 to 95 or 96. One of the questions is a terrible question, so nobody got very many points anyhow, so it's really out of 100. If you've got 70 or more, you're sort of still just doing okay or better than okay. If you've got less than 70, you're doing less than okay. If you get less than 60, you're not doing okay at all. So that's the grade distribution. The purpose of doing next Wednesday is getting the people that do not okay up to doing okay or better. So that's where we're headed. How many of you are freshmen? How many of you are sophomores? So do professors at Seattle give you essay and short answer exams? Or are they not typical? They aren't typical. Some of you just aren't used to doing this. Or you can't do it. One or the other. What we're going to go through is, this exam is actually pretty straightforward. Some of you made a straightforward job of it. If you got a 90 or above, you did just fine. Actually, 85 or above, which is fine. But there are details that when you're doing this sort of analysis, you should try to be clear. Which means that, and I'll do this next time when I do directions. When I say using graphs to explain something, that usually means using graphs and English sentences explain something. So getting some explanation for what you're drawing, especially if you don't fully label something, makes it really difficult to grade. So we'll just walk through this and show you where you would have. Explain the difference between quantity demanded of a good and demand for a good. Okay, this is a fundamental piece that we've gone through a half dozen times. When we put up a demand, so this is not the answer to the question yet. I'm just going to explain what's going on first. So when we talk about demand, we're talking about the whole demand schedule. It tells us about a set of prices and a set of quantities associated with those prices. So when we say we shift the demand curve, we shift that whole thing. Okay? So Demand is the whole demand function. It tells you the relationship between prices and quantities. Okay, and that's really the answer to the demand question. The demand describes the market's relationship between various quantities demanded and various prices. Quantity demanded, so that's demand. Quantity demanded refers to a point on the demand curve and quantity at a particular price. So you have a pair of numbers. You have 6 and 5. $6, actually it's 5 and 6. The quantity is 6, and this is $6. There's that pair. This is the quantity demanded at $6. That's the difference. The distinction is important because of the next question. So, just to be clear on this, what you needed to do was simply say demand refers to the entire set of quantities demanded at various prices. And quantity demanded refers to a particular amount at a particular price. Now, the reason that's important is when we go to question 2A, which is what is the first law of demand? And when you read your exam, be careful how you read this, because what happens is you skim over this and you don't catch the little tiny difference in what you're writing. The first law of demand says the quantity demanded I'll go ahead and write this in 3 orange. The quantity demanded varies inversely with price. So what that says is, as the price starts going down, the quantity demanded starts rising. That's all we're saying. There's a notation that says as price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. As price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. That's the first law of demand. And if you got 3 points on that question, it's probably because you mixed up demand and quantity demanded. You need to understand the relationship, because the first law of demand, and you see this in the media all the time, people screw it up. They invoke the first law of demand talking about an entire demand curve. The entire demand curve describes the first law of demand, and it has all these quantities on it, but it has nothing to do with shifts. Only referring to movement along a demand curve. There are no shifts involved here. So this is when you're looking at the law of demand, it's movements along demand curves. The law of supply is simply the opposite of that. It's the quantity supply. So we can have a supply curve, which is, here's 10, 9, 8, 7, 4, 3, 2, and there can be 10, 9. So the law of supply says that the quantity demanded, quantity supplied, quantity supplied varies positively with price. Or, if the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. If the price goes down, the quantity supplied goes down. that leads us to C. So what does this tell us about how you graphically represent these things? It simply means on the demand side, the demand curve is always going to be downward sloping. That's what the first law of demand says. You have a downward sloping demand curve. We never see demand curves that look like this. It violates the first law of demand. And likewise, on the supply side, you have upward sloping supply curves. That's all I wanted you to do. And a lot of you sort of read into this and started saying, well, what it means graphically is that they intersect somewhere. Well, not really. Because you can have two demand curves that intersect. The feature here is that the law of supply implies something about the shape of this curve. It implies this positive relationship. It's trivial in a sense, but it drives all of our analysis. Likewise with the demand curve. The downward sloping demand curve drives our analysis. So, you couldn't answer this thing pretty simply, and just not much more than what I've done here anymore. Or actually less. I think I left out this stuff, although it's helpful. I guess if all you got out of this class in the 12 weeks, was it 12 weeks? I haven't counted this right. If this is all you got out of the class is an understanding of this, and an understanding of how they shift around, you'll have gotten a lot out of the class. You'll get an understanding of how most economic analysis is done. But you need to invoke these things. In other words, you need to know that there is a law of demand and a law of supply. And in fact, we don't even, when you get above a certain level, you don't talk about law of supply because it's just implied in the law of demand. All we really have is the law of demand. But there's an upward sloping curve and a downward sloping curve, and sooner or later they intersect, and that tells you about market phenomena. Any questions on these first two questions? Okay, what causes demand curves to shift? Explain. So, I was pretty lax on the explain part, but that's where we get into, once you put something up there, you need to be able to explain what it is. You need to be able to explain to everybody what it is. That's why we're here. So, so demand is equal to what? It's equal to some function of the price of the good itself. This is the demand for good X. And this is movement along the curve. So what this part of this is the law of demand. And then we start getting in these other things, which are also law of demand in a more sophisticated way. Price of substitutes, not substitutes. You can't just break down substitutes. It's price of substitutes. Price of complements. What else? Price expectations, tastes, and income. So those are the things that shift demand curves. And the explain part of this is PS means price of substitutes. And PS increases, demand for X decreases, shifts in, or excuse me, demand for X increases. So substitutes in the demand for good, substitutes for good X and the demand for good X shift in the same direction. So all this is describing, what you just described here, is here's the demand curve, and when the price of a substitute goes up, demand shifts out. That's all we're describing there. Price of complements. The price of a complement increases. Demand for good X decreases, which is a shift. You're moving back. Here you're moving out, here you're moving back. That's all we're seeing there. And we're just think of it from the standpoint of, the gasoline questions that we do in a bit are good examples. If the price of gasoline goes up, the demand for, big gas guzzling Cadillacs is going to go down because they're complements. So some of you have to remember what the E stands for. So 7 or 8 of you just said E, that's got to be elasticity. And you went off on some tangent, so you got to be careful. And 2 of you have your professor as Professor Peterson. I'm Nickerson. Peterson's the other guy. You got to be careful on these things. Price expectations. If you expect prices to rise, then the demand is going to go down. It's going to shift in. Excuse me. If the expectation is that prices are going to rise, the demand today is going to go out. Simply because you're going to buy stuff now because you think the price is going to go up. If you think the price is going to go down, what are you going to do? You're going to wait. And in fact, one of the big worries in Europe right now is that people have expectations that the prices are going to fall. And this is generally speaking, we're not just talking about one good. Prices are going to fall. That means that people are holding back because their money's going to be worth more in 6 months. So they're staying away from consuming goods. And you have, a malaise going on in Europe in terms of consumption of goods. Then you have tastes. Tastes change, and they can impact demand in either direction. So polo shirts are in demand one year and they're not in demand another year. Short skirts are in demand in 1 year and they're not in demand another year, all driven by tastes. And we can't really say much about these. So you can't explain a situation very well and go test it very easily by saying, oh, the reason demand increases is because taste changed. You have to get a lot more detailed than that because taste can move in either direction. And then the last one of these, of course, is income. And if income rises, and you have a normal good, demand will increase or shift out. And likewise, if income falls and it's a normal good, demand will decrease or shift in. If it's an inferior good, the opposite is true. It's an inferior good. If your income rises, demand falls. And if income falls, demand rises. And goods are in, there are lots of inferior goods are out there, and you can start thinking of them. I used to do this assignment. I don't do it anymore because the grocery store is not as good as it used to be. But you can try this. It's worth, you can get 6 of them in the car, 5 of you can have a couple of beers, you can go have fun at QFC and quality in the what's the name of that grocery store down on Martin thinking There's a discount grocery store.
Grocery outlet.
Grocery outlet.
Yeah.
So you go into grocery outlet and you wander up and down the aisles and you will see a whole set of goods. Some of them you will recognize. Some of them, you go in the produce section and you go, I've never seen this before. And you'll see tons of certain kinds of produce. And then you'll go to QFC, and the best one to go to is University Village. Outside of Costco, that University Village has the largest sales of premium wines on the West Coast. It's just one of those places. And you go in that place, and it's a whole different set of goods. Even the darn dog food's different. You know, the dog food in QFC is prissy dog food. And the dog food in, you know, whatever it is, the food outlet, is just for regular old dogs. But it's income generating. Although the sad thing is, there is a study done on this. You know why there's so much canned dog food in poor neighborhood grocery stores? It's protein. People eat it. It's real cheap meat protein. So that's one of the reasons it exists. But if you go down to these places, you can see income effects. And you can see that the income effects actually change the way businesses behave. Because they're appealing to that particular market and they're appealing to an income class. You can skip all the grocery stuff if you want to ask me this question. But you get the idea. Okay, any questions on this? This sort of, I mean, you need to sort of explain what you're doing when you answer this. Yeah.
So for price expectations, if price expectations goes up, doesn't demand, you said demand goes up because people expect the price to go up?
If you expect prices to go up, you'll buy stuff today.
Okay.
If you expect it to go down, you'll hold your money and wait. Someone else have a question? Yeah, the next one is a bad question, but I asked it anyhow. So, how come some shifts are large and some shifts are small? Well, the simple answer, and probably the only answer you can come up with, is some goods are really strong substitutes for other goods. If that's true, there'll be big shifts. So the closer they are as substitutes, or the closer they are as complements, the bigger the shifts will be in responses to price changes for those goods. If they're not related, so for instance, the price of gasoline doesn't do much to the price of tomatoes because they're not substitutes and they're not complements. But the price of cucumbers and the price of tomatoes may be close to each other, or maybe more closely related. The same thing with income. It's how closely the good is related to income. How big is this impact going to be? So, it's not a great question. I don't know what else to say about it. Needless to say, you probably won't see it on Wednesday. Yes?
So like the stronger the complement or substitute, the less efficient.
Yeah. And the same thing with income, the stronger the relationship with income. So that's why, for instance, goods that are really high parts of the budget, we'll get to this in a minute, but things that take up a lot of your budget are more important on the income side. If your rent goes up 50%, you've got a problem, because that's half your budget. Okay, now the supply. Any more questions on the demand side? Okay, supply side. So one thing I should do first, and I should have done originally, and I haven't done this, I haven't tried to mark people right or wrong based on it, but I've been sloppy at drawing some of the graphs myself. When you draw a supply curve, what you're saying is that suppliers at particular prices will supply certain quantities of goods. And the supply curve should always start somewhere up this axis. In other words, that sort of supply curve is nonsensical. What we're saying is that there's some price at which people start producing goods and selling them. So there's an entry price. So your supply curve should always start somewhere over on this axis, simply because there's some entry price. If it's less than 0, they don't start. Okay, so on the supply side, supply is equal to a function of the price of the good itself. Again, this is movement along the supply curve and refers to the law of supply. And then we have price of inputs, changes in technology. I should just say technology. What else? Matter? Price of alternative outputs. And regulation. Okay, so those are the 4 main factors. And then we get into the price of an input increases, the quantity, the supply decreases or shifts in. So here's a supply curve with the price of an input equal to $1. Here's a supply curve with the price of an input equal to $2. Just shifts it back. In other words, firms are saying, think of it in terms of the entry price. They need another $1 before they're going to enter into this business. That's all it's saying. Changes in technology normally increase supply. In other words, we sort of define technological change as things that decrease costs. So if you come up with a technological change and it really increases costs, it's not really technological change, it's just whatever. My dad went to engineering school at the University of Michigan, and this was in the dark ages, so this is 1947 and 48. And they were in a machinist class. He was a mechanical engineer. They had an automobile engine there that got something like 62 miles per gallon. And everybody goes, why? You know, why didn't they get this out of the market? Well, at that time, it cost like $250,000 to put the thing together. All the technological improvements they put into it were total wastes of money. You couldn't afford to do it, so it wasn't a real technological change. Science could do, so it's the difference between technology and science. Science can build efficient engines, but it can't build the technology that allows you to actually produce them. So that's the technological change part. If the price of an alternative output increases, your supply decreases. So it's simply a matter of, think of corn and wheat grown in the same fields. If the price of corn goes up, you decrease the supply of wheat that you're producing and increase the supply of corn. That's all we're saying here. And regulation normally decreases supply. And we don't mean that on some sort of ornery way. It's just regulations impose costs, and maybe those costs are legitimate. So you may want to put costs on carbon, or you may want to tax people for building, if somebody's going to go in and build houses, you might want to put heavy taxes on them when they build, so that you get the public sewer lines and the public water lines and serve them. But it's going to cost people more. So regulation, generally speaking, as you increase regulations, you're going to have decreases in supply in the marketplace. Any questions on this one? Yes, sir.
Can you keep on saying about alternative output?
Alternative output, okay. So, first I'll give you the long explanation, then I'll give you the short explanation. This doesn't surprise you. So think of it in terms of, you got 160 acres, and right now you have 40 of it in wheat and 120 of it in corn. Okay? And you made those decisions because this is $6 a bushel, and this is $8 a bushel. And there are all sorts of different costs involved, but that's how you came up with the combination. And then all of a sudden, Congress passes a law, which it did. It said in the wintertime, gasoline has to have between 8 and 15% ethanol in it. And ethanol is produced from corn. And the price of corn all of a sudden goes to, instead of $6 a bushel, it goes to $12 a bushel. What are you going to do next year? Are you going to plant any wheat? You're going to produce more corn, right? Because you can get more of this. And less wheat, so you may go down, you may in fact go to zero, we don't know what the combination is going to be, but you're going to produce more corn. You're going to substitute out of one form of production to another form of production. And we see this happening right now. I mean, the ethanol example, there are 4 bills in the House of Representatives and 2 in the Senate. And they all have co-sponsors. I mean, they're bipartisan co-sponsored bills to get rid of the ethanol requirements. Because what happens is we produce too much corn, it goes into the, everyone's producing corn. Corn's the worst stuff on the environment. It sucks up all sorts of nutrients. You have to fertilize the hell out of it. It's got all sorts of problems with it. But farmers love it. You plant the stuff, you wait until September 18th and you just cut it all down and sell it to somebody that's going to make ethanol out of it. So they're in Washington, D.C. telling everybody, oh no, don't get rid of the ethanol. But the other thing is, it's not clear that ethanol does anything. It may actually hurt the environment, even in terms of the gasoline. So there are all sorts of problems with it. But you have these trade-offs that come in. So if you look 15 years ago in the Midwest, there was a lot more wheat production and a lot less corn production. Now it's very heavy in corn production. And it's not because we like fructose. It's not because, the stuff we get at McDonald's gets sweetened with the stuff. It's because of mostly the ethanol system. Pardon me? Well, the theory is that it causes less pollution. You can still fire your engine, and there's less pollution involved. There are arguments that say that's not true. If you drive a motorboat, the ethanol just kills the outboard motors. They don't burn hot enough, or they burn too hot. I don't know which it is, but so you search around. So there are 2 places on Camino Island that sell non-ethanol gasoline, and they're both licensed as marine dealers. So when you drive up in your car, you can fill up your car too. Very few places in the state of Washington don't have ethanol blanched gasoline these days. So if you drive up to, you've all filled up gas in your cars, you'll see they contain up to 10% ethanol. So they're telling you, and if it says that, it likely does, because it's a lot cheaper than gasoline. Did that answer your question? That was a long way around the block. Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain the price of inputs one again, please?
Okay. So, we'll do this more later on. Just do it in terms, let's say that you make bread, okay? And each loaf of bread is 2 cups of flour, 2 tablespoons of yeast, a pinch of salt, and that's it. That actually works. And you make lots of loaves of bread, you do it on a grand scale, and this stuff costs 50 cents a cup, and this costs 20 cents, and this costs 0.001 cents. Okay? And you're producing 100 loaves of bread. So we could figure out our costs, just calculate what the costs are going to be. It's 50 plus whatever the rest of it is, $4, 54 something. What happens if the price of flour, so in your this is your margin, you're at the margin, the last loaf of bread you make, you're just breaking even on, you're happy as a clam, and all of a sudden, the price of flour goes up to $2 a cup. What's going to happen to the amount of bread you produce? It's going to go down. So where was the example? I was listening to this last night. It's not the Ukraine. It may be Venezuela. I guess it doesn't matter. They were talking about the changes in prices of flour over the last 6 months. Let's say it was Venezuela, going from buying 100-pound bags originally for, say, $50, and then 2 months later they were costing $120, and 2 months after that they were costing $280. Combinations of inflation and lost oil revenues and all sorts of stuff. But that Venezuela is going to have, just watch the news over the next 6 months. They're just going to implode. They do not have the resources to feed people. Any more questions on this one? Gains from trade. Boy, some of you could write really good novels. The people went off on tangents on this. It was just terrific. Poor dog has to listen to me grading papers sometimes. Here's the squeals from me and looks at me like I killed somebody. I didn't kill one or the other. A lot of this question. Gains from trade. Here's a market. So we'll start with quantity, or price up here, quantity per unit of time up here. This is in dollars. And we've invoked this system of supply and demand for good as. And we say there's a market equilibrium. Q star and P star. Where Q star is the amount that will be produced, and P star is the amount that will be in the equilibrium price in the marketplace. So let's start with that. What is the area I just shaded in? That's cost. That's the supplier's cost. In other words, at any point, any quantity, they need to get a little more than their cost before they're going to produce it. So that's what that supply curve reflects. It's some measure of cost somewhere. What is this stuff? That's producer surplus. That's the gain they get. That's the excess over costs. that they get by producing Q-star items. In other words, if this is $10, if the price is $10, on the first item, they might be making a $6 gain from trade. We wouldn't call it profit yet. But that's just the difference between the price and what it costs. And by the time you get to the marginal unit, how much producer surplus is there on the last unit? There's zero. It costs them $10 and he sells it for $10. No gains from trade. Gains from trade for the producer are the excess over cost he gets for producing each unit. What is it for the consumer? Well, the consumer gets consumer surplus. And the demand curve reflects the willingness for people to pay for certain numbers of goods. So you're willing to pay $10, but you only have to pay $6. Your gains from trade are the $4 difference. It's that excess over what you have to pay. So on the first set of goods, it's bigger, and then it gets smaller, moving down the demand curve. So some people aren't getting very much consumer surplus at all. But the gains from trade in a marketplace are consumer surplus and producer surplus. And typically, both producers and consumers are getting those surpluses. That's why they trade. It's important to understand this consumer and producer surplus econ battle, because it's this is how we evaluate whether a tax has a burden on one set of people or another set of people. It's how we figure out if there are gains from trade from international trade. It's how we look at who wins and loses with rent controls. It's all involved in these gains from trade, either consumer surplus or producer surplus. That's where the market's generating whatever you want to call it, profits or joy or utility or whatever it is for producers and consumers. There's nothing complicated about this. But again, it's one of those essential pieces of this market analysis that you need to have in place. Questions? Okay, using graphs, explain what happens in a market that is starting in equilibrium when the demand for the good increases. What happens to equilibrium? Price, quantity, producer surplus, and consumer surplus. Okay, henceforth, listen up. When I say using graphs, there's a parenthetical expression after that that says using English sentences as well. In other words, you need to explain to me what the graph means. Just put the graph up there doesn't tell me anything. So we'll start with the graph. Here's the graph. So again, look up a second. That's your starting point in all this. That's the way it gets labeled. It tells you a unit of time. There's a quantity per unit of time, because if you double the unit of time, demand's going to change, supply's going to change. So it's quantity demanded per unit of time. It's a price. In this case, I have it in dollars. It's good X, and this is the supply of X, and this is the demand for X. And if we look at the market, we're going to get QE and P. That's where we start. And we also get costs down here, producer surplus here, and consumer surplus there. Everybody got that? Okay, let's stop here. If you have a question at this point, let's ask it now, because we're just going to go to the next stage. Everybody okay? Okay. We have an increase in demand. For whatever reason, we don't describe it here. Here's demand 2. And when we say an increase in demand, we mean it various prices, the quantity demand is going to go up, so the curve shifts out. So demand increases. So forget about the graph for a second. What's a good reason for demand to increase? So these are always easy examples. The Food and Drug Administration comes out and tells you that if you eat hummus, you're going to have clear skin and be able to run the 100-yard dash in under 10 seconds. Okay? So we know that the demand for hummus is going to go up. Okay? What are the grocery stores going to see? Before anything else happens, we get this announcement. The guy runs whatever it is. This is in Whole Foods, it's the produce department, and QFC, it's the dairy department. Just depends on where they want to stick their hummus. They come down on Tuesday morning, and how much hummus is left in the shelf? There's no hummus there. It's all been purchased. There's a shortage. So the first thing that occurs in this marketplace, you may not even see it at first, is the quantity demand's gone up at the equilibrium price. That's what's happened with the shift. That's the first thing that happens. You get this increase in quantity demanded. Everybody and their brother wants clear skin and the fastest legs on the planet. Okay, that's where we're sitting. And they go and buy this stuff. What does the supplier say? Nah, that's interesting. Let's get some more of this stuff in. Okay, because we're running out of it. But you know what we can do? We can start increasing the price. So let's increase the price. And after a while, after the price bounces around, they get their supply stuff correct, and they get enough garbanzo beans and all that, they end up with PE2 and QE2. You end up with a new market equilibrium. So there are a couple things to say, and some of this is a little tricky, but you need to stare at it for a second. So what can you say unambiguously about the total cost of producing the new amount of hummus? It's gone up, right? This used to be what it cost, and now you add on those costs. So that's the first thing you can say. The cost to producers to produce this extra stuff's gone up. It's sort of a common sense answer. Okay, so we know that costs have gone up to this new, and they've increased by this much. What's happened to producer surplus?
Getting bigger.
It's gotten bigger. It unambiguously gets bigger. So the price goes up, these guys are better off. So producer surplus, or excuse me, consumer surplus now looks like that. And, excuse me, that's producer surplus. And where did some of that producer surplus, new producer surplus come from? So this stuff used to be what? Consumer surplus. It's when there's an increase in demand, there's a shift. The price goes up, and the producer gets some of the gains from trade that some people used to be getting as consumer surplus. So that's what this stuff is. That's just used to be consumer surplus, now it's producer surplus. What's this stuff? That's new producer surplus that's caused by higher price of the good. You're simply producing more of this stuff at higher costs. So there's new gains from trade here, at least on the producer side. What happens on the consumer side? This is where you probably have written next to your answer, maybe. Okay, if you have maybe, it's because you said consumer surplus goes down, maybe. In other words, we know that this disappears, right? That's a decrease in consumer surplus. But we also know that we have all this out here. That's the consumer surplus you're getting by buying more of this stuff. And you value it a lot higher now because you're running faster and your skin is gorgeous. Okay, so your consumer surplus could well go up because your demand curve shifted out so much, you just value it more. But you really can't tell, because I could have shifted this thing this much, and consumer surplus would have gone down. You shifted a lot, and consumer surplus goes up. There's a maybe. It's how big is this demand curve shifting? It's unambiguous that costs go up. It's unambiguous that producer surplus goes up. It's ambiguous whether or not consumer surplus goes up or down. This applies incidentally to the question later on when we're talking about demand increases in China for energy. Well, the demand curve shifts out, we know that. The Chinese are just happier. They got their demand increases. But in the United States, consumer surplus probably went down because prices went up and demand didn't go up. So it depends on what market you're looking at. Are there any questions on this one? I mean, this is the process, but you have to start off with the market phenomenon. The market phenomenon is you change demand. If you increase demand, there's a shortage. If you decrease demand, there's a surplus. And those price and supply adjustments start taking place. But that first impact is what is at the old equilibrium price, do you have a shortage or a surplus now? And then what happens to the marketplace in terms of the adjustments? That's why we call prices signaling devices. If all of a sudden consumers start bidding up the price of something, it tells firms, oh, there's been an increase in demand. But if all of a sudden inventories start building and they're not selling stuff, they say to themselves, uh-oh, there's been a decrease in demand. So prices are signaling what's going on. People aren't willing to buy as much as they were at that equilibrium price, or they want to buy more at that equilibrium price. Questions? Okay. So what makes some goods more price elastic than other goods? One. So that's the first thing. The more substitutes there are for the good, the more elastic it's going to be. I mean, just think in common sense terms. If you can switch away from it easily because there's a substitute out there, that means it's elastic. And elasticities may change at different price levels. So when we were looking at the minimum wage issue the other day, it may very well be true that relatively small changes in price, minimum wages, elasticity is practically zero. There aren't very many substitutes for it. It doesn't make sense to do it. But at high prices, there are lots of substitutes, or you may just get out of the business. So that's one. Two, what's the next one? Importance in the budget. Salt. Again, you don't know how much the price of salt is, and you buy a pound of it every 2 years, or if you're like me, you probably buy one every 2 months. But you still don't know what the price is. But it's not very important in the budget. On the other hand, if it's rent or gasoline, or certain types of medical care, dental care, if it's not essential, if it doesn't hurt, and dental care is expensive, people don't get dental care. That's two. And the third reason is time. The second law of demand says the longer the period of time you have to adjust to a price change, the bigger will be the price change. Why is that? because it gives you a longer period of time to find substitutes. So you can let things wear out, you can go ahead and figure out how to do some sort of substitute for something you were doing before. So time is always a factor in this. No tangents here. Any questions on this? This was, you can answer this in a really short fashion. Take it. 3-minute break. Okay, the longer the period of time after the price change, the longer the period of time you get for substitutes.
Okay.
That's his overall. Okay, and I was referring to that, I gave you full credit for it, but that's the question of how big is that demand shift?
It's an ambiguous.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
She doesn't know that. Really? In the press. Schedule's really confusing. I would choose. Yeah. Yeah, but. It's okay. She'll figure it out. Yeah, we'll learn. Yeah. He's very slow. He'll do that. Well, we were so close to me, but. Guys,
9. Okay, show graphically what happens to equilibrium price and quantity in the gasoline market for each of the following. Who gains and who loses? Okay, first is the price of oil. It's 9.9, price of oil. Price of oil, hang on, take a look here. So we're going to say the price of oil falls. What is oil to the gasoline market? It's an input in the gasoline. It's what we make gasoline out of, right? What's going to happen to the supply curve of gasoline? The price of an input falls. It's going to shift out, right? Supply curve shifts out. Here's the one oil price. Here's the lower oil price. And the market phenomenon, take it to QP2 and QE2. So you have price falls, the price of gasoline falls, the quantity of gasoline that's purchased in the marketplace increases. What happens to consumer surplus? Consumer surplus unambiguously gets bigger by that amount. Okay, just part of that is a transfer from producers. Producer used to be producer surplus, now it's consumer surplus. Part of it is the actual increase in gains from trade from having lower cost oil supplies. That's the smaller increase here. What happens to producer surplus? You don't really know. It depends on how big this shift is. If all of a sudden they come up with this wonderful technology, if all of a sudden it comes up with this wonderful technology and it drives oil production costs really low, so this is a huge shift, what's going to happen to producer surplus? It's going to get big. But if it's a smaller shift because the technology changes that much, they could actually see some of their producer surplus decrease. So you don't really know, but you do know that it changes. Everybody okay with that one? I guess the other thing to keep in mind is we're doing these, and we've done 5 of them to do this. Some of the stuff you don't know. You need to know more information about how big a shift is or how something changes in the marketplace. You can't tell until you start doing empirical work. So the second one is oil suppliers learn how to use fracking to pump oil out of the ground. So what happens? Changing technology. You got an improvement in technology, presumably supply changes. Exact same answer we just had. Consumer surplus unambiguously goes up. Suppliers overall may have producer surplus gains. People go, well, why would they do that? Why wouldn't they have producer surplus? What situation would they have producer surplus gains? Well, there may be money to be had. It may just be other people earning the money. So as we study the firm, we'll see that there is some ambiguity, but that the consumer is going to be driving the price. And if we're in the elastic portion of the demand curve, one thing will happen. If we're in the elastic portion of the demand curve, something else might happen. Again, it depends on how big the shift is. So same answer as that one. So the government starts subsidizing electric cars. So you needed to pick something. I'll pick demand. They give you a tax break, which they do. I've bought 2 Priuses now, and I got a great big tax deduction for doing it. Don't ask me why they give me a tax deduction, but they do. And it's, you know, all of a sudden, I have an increase in demand for electric cars. I have 2 kids that normally would be driving gasoline cars that are driving half electric cars. The demand for gasoline goes down. So what's happened is demand shifts in because people are shifting away from gasoline cars towards electric cars. And suppliers lose. what happens to demanders of gasoline? The consumer surplus actually goes down, right? But what happens to the price of gasoline? It goes down too. And you're saying to yourself, well, why would consumer surplus go down when price is going down? Well, it's just getting smaller because some people are leaving the marketplace. And we're happy. We're much happier when other people do stuff that takes away from the stuff we like to do. So you end up with a lower price, a lower quantity in that market. And keep in mind, the general consumer is better off because they now have, what they're really buying is transportation when they buy these cars, and they're happier with their electric cars. But in this gasoline market, we have less gas.
Top would say,
Say it again.
the top would say,
There, gasoline. Okay, China's economic growth, yeah, that was the one thing to keep in mind here. When you're looking at these things, we're looking at the gasoline market. Some of you started looking at the electric car market. And in some instances, you're looking at the oil market. In some instances, you're looking at the energy market. We're looking at gasoline markets here. We're trying to figure out what goes into producing gasoline and how that affects the marketplace, how people demand it, and what affects gasoline prices here. Okay, China's economic growth and demand for energy increases 100%. What's going to happen? Demand for oil is going to do what?
Increase.
You got to do two steps here. The demand for oil goes up. If the demand for oil goes up, what happens to the price of oil? The price of oil is going to go up. If the price of oil goes up, what happens to the supply of gasoline? It's going to decrease because the price of an input has gone up. We have PE2, QE2. Consumers lose because they're paying higher prices. And again, you're in this ambiguous situation with producers. Depends on where you are in the marketplace. So with all of these, you have to go back to question, where is it? Wherever the question is that talks about, oh, question 6, expansion trade. You're looking at producer surplus and consumer surplus. And as it turns out, you can only tell with definitively one or the other. Or you can say the way I drew it, this happened. And actually, when did you do that? This is the sort of stuff that I'm hoping, actually I hope by next Wednesday, but I'm certainly hoping by the end of the quarter you can just blast through this stuff instantaneously. Draw a graph, you're sitting in the bar getting in an argument with somebody, and become a smart ass and start drawing graphs and saying, look, I can prove this. This is the stuff we do. Okay. Using graphs, explain why we tax cigarettes and not candy. And the reason is, the demand curve for cigarettes is inelastic. Increased price, you don't change it much. So that when you add a tax on, you just add it on to the supply curve, there's little change in output. Q1 to Q2, there's a change in the price, P1, P2, and there's lots of tax revenue. So it's predictable. You can figure out what the tax revenue is. Look up for a second. Oops. This is the tax revenue, the way we're drawing this. It's the difference between what the supplier gets and what the consumer pays. That's what goes to the government. And then this stuff, which wasn't part of this answer, is what? That's dead weight loss. That's the dead weight loss of taxation. Now you look at, did we say candy or did we say something? There's the demand curve for candy. Let's draw the supply curve, approximately the same shape. Put the same tax on it, just like that. Supply plus the tax. There's the original equilibrium, but when you put the tax on, what happens? Big change in amount consumed. You go from Q1 to Q2 because it's elastic demand. It's relatively flat. And smaller tax revenue associated with it and a bigger impact in the candy market because people are now eating ice cream and fruit and all sorts of stuff. The other sweets in the world. So the reason we're taxing cigarettes rather than candy is because cigarettes are relatively more inelastic than candy is. And that allows us to generate more income for tax revenue and also causes less impact in the market in terms of the output the producers have. And Washington is a great example of this. The state of Washington has the highest liquor taxes in the United States. And our consumption of liquor isn't a hell of a lot different than anybody else's. We still buy stuff, yeah.
Is there less dead weight loss with inelastic demands, or is that just because of the specific graph?
If the supply curves were identical for starting, and you added the tax on, there would be a bigger dead weight loss with an elastic good. In other words, that's always going to be the case.
But
And
that
that's
would,
simply because the dead weight loss is caused by the decrease in output.
right, but that wouldn't be the reason that they tax cigarettes as opposed to candy?
Well, except
Or-
that's part of what we're saying, and it
Okay.
has less impact on quantity
Okay,
of
okay.
output. Is the dead weight loss is incorporated in that output change. So this is the question on Wednesday, and I'm pretty sure that either 10 or 11 are going to be one of the questions on Wednesday. Go through the whole thing, draw one market, put on a tax, and know how to draw the tax, and know how to identify the total revenue, and then draw the other market with a much more elastic demand curve, and explain the difference between the two. It's pretty straightforward, but you ought to be able to draw it.
It's like, I was at the grocery store the other day, I like Reese's, so they had like the 4 for $1, whole pack, but then like all the other substitutes were just straight up still like $1 and something. They're trying
That's not taxes, that's just marketing. They're trying to get, they think that if you eat 4 Reese's, you'll become addicted to them, I guess. I don't know.
that's why I was wondering if they were trying to push them, the demand.
Or, there's a producer out there that's just trying to get you back on sweets that you walk by. All sorts of things. Ones I love. It's a little mom and pop grocery store going on the Camino Island. It's in Stanley. It has this big sign, and it has milk, special on milk, gallon, 4.56, and right underneath it says special on Bud Light, $3.27 for a 6-pack. People out there are making the choices whether they're buying their beer or they're buying their kids. Yes. It's cheaper to buy the beer. Okay. Sellers can always pass on the taxes to the buyers. Using graphs, right? Explain why this is not necessarily so. This is just, again, if you have an elasticity question. If this is the demand curve, and this is the supply curve, and you impose a tax, there's the price, and the tax is added on to that, and you end up coming back to here. You're going to have one set of increases in price and one impact on people, on producers. I'm starting to lose it here. Let's do a less gentle one. So here's a situation where a demand, relatively steep supply curve, a relatively steep demand curve, and you impose a tax that shifts the supply curve up by the amount of tax. Producers lose this much, and consumers lose this much. In other words, the price is going to go up, but the price is not going to go up by the amount of the tax. It's going to go up by less than the amount of the tax. And both sides are going to bear some of the burden. It is true. Does everybody see this? I mean, all we're doing is split the burden here. But then you can go ahead and say, okay, here's the supply curve, and here's the demand curve for insulin. Okay, and we impose that tax, and there's the tax, and there's very little decrease in the quantity. Who bears the burden there? They both bear the burden, but the supplier only bears that much and the consumer bears that much. So the more inelastic the demand curve is, the more the consumers are going to bear the burden, and the more inelastic the supply curve is, all things holding the same, the more the supplier is going to bear the burden. And again, what we see, for instance, in cigarettes, in booze, is that consumers are generally the ones that bear the burden, because there's very inelastic demand for those particular goods. In rent situations where you have housing, it's the producer that's going to bear the burden, because the demand for housing is not going to shift, and the price is simply going to reflect the fact that the producer has to pay taxes. Okay, do you have any questions? On Monday, we will talk about price discrimination and tuition. See you then.